joining us. Thank you for this webinar series. And to introduce myself, my name is Matthew Coomber. I'm an Episcopal priest and an associate professor of biblical studies at St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa. And the webinar series that we're taking part in is a continuation of a series of conferences on Bible and justice here at St. Ambrose. So I'd like to thank St. Ambrose for hosting, and especially our tech person, Brandon Larson, for being here on Saturday to help us with this. And he's going to speak to you in a moment about technical issues with this format. But this is also done in conjunction with the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice, of which I'm one of the directors. And our mandate is to bring biblical scholarship and grassroots activism together for various justice endeavors. So I'd like to thank them also for their sponsorship. And I think with that, I will hand it over to Brandon, who's going to explain how things are done, and then on to Crystal, who will introduce our esteemed guest, Gerald West.
Hey everybody, Brandon Larson here. I'm glad you could all join us. Essentially, the only way that you're going to be able to communicate with the speaker and Matthew and Crystal is through the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. I think the last 45 minutes or so is designated for questions and answers with Gerald. So if you have questions, and maybe Crystal can clarify this, but throughout the talk, you can put them down in that lower left-hand corner, and Crystal and Matt will then share them with Gerald when it's time to ask questions. So with that, here's Crystal.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. So just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Crystal Hall. I'm a doctoral student in New Testament at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I'm currently living and working in Baltimore, where I do the majority of my contextual Bible study work with grassroots anti-poverty organizations. Before I introduce Dr. West, I would invite you, if you haven't done so already, to introduce yourself briefly in the chat box. Just let us know your name and where you're coming from. In the tradition of contextual Bible study, we like to do a round of introductions, but are obviously limited somewhat by the webinar platform in doing that. So if you haven't done so, please let us know your name and where you're joining in from. So we have folks from really all over the place. Stu from Southern California, Glenn from Davenport, Iowa, Jasmine, a student of mine from Union Theological Seminary in New York, Barry from Kentucky, Jennifer from Denver, Colorado. I think that's Shanda, also from Union in New York. Is there anyone else who'd like to jump in before I introduce Dr. West on the chat box? Haven't seen anybody else just yet, but that's all right. And as we go along, as Brandon said, I would invite you to be raising your questions as they arise during Dr. West's presentation. And Matthew and I will be moderating those questions. And after Dr. West has finished his presentation, then we will we'll communicate those questions to Dr. West, and he'll then respond. So I would invite you to be bringing up your questions in an ongoing way during the presentation, and then we'll be communicating those to Dr. West. So without any further ado, it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Gerald West, who is a senior professor in the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. His main area of academic work is African biblical hermeneutics. Within this field, he's focused on 4 related areas: the use of the Bible in African liberation struggles, the role of ordinary readers of the Bible in liberation hermeneutics, the history of the Bible's reception by indigenous Africans, and the various ways in which the Bible is presented in the African public realm. For more than 25 years, he has been involved in the work of the Ujamaa Center, a research and community center at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And this aspect of his work relates to critical engagement with the Bible and particular sites of struggle in African contexts such as race, class, gender, HIV, sexuality, the environment, and disability. So thank you so much, Dr. West, for being with us today, and we certainly look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Thank you. Thank you to Matthew and to Brandon for enabling this to take place, and thank you especially to all of those of you who have come to engage together. I really do hope we will have time for conversation. I'm delighted that I follow my colleague Boloetti, who was with you a couple of weeks ago. We have worked closely together for many years, and it's a great joy to follow up on his engagement with you, and I've been able to listen to that, so that was great. I thought I might start by taking you back to the late 1980s here in South Africa, in the province in which I live, KwaZulu-Natal. At the time I was completing my PhD studies on the role of the Bible in the liberation struggle. I was a bit frustrated by liberation hermeneutics because although it claimed an epistemological privilege for the poor, I didn't really see the poor as part of the reading process, the Bible reading process. And so I was sort of struggling with that and talking about that to other colleagues. And in the midst of this sort of intellectual grappling, our province was severely traumatized by state orchestrated violence. The apartheid state was moving against the United Democratic Front, the UDF, which was a loose alliance of liberation movements, pockets of civil society that were working for change. And our province was deeply conflicted by state-sponsored violence. And I remember one day I was in a refugee camp. People had been chased from the area where they lived. The state had come in, police had come in, the army had come in. We're using local black members of the Inkatha group, working with them to target the UDF, the United Democratic Front, and people had lost their lives, they had lost their homes, and there were refugee camps springing up all over our city. And so some of us were involved in just trying to be of help. As part of the liberation struggle, we were involved in various things, but I can remember one day in a refugee camp taking down some statements from a group of people. We were trying to document what had happened to them, who'd attacked them, how could they analyze the different forces that were arrayed against them, what had they lost in terms of their family, in terms of their homes, etc. Just trying to document so we had a record against the apartheid state. And we were sitting around talking and sharing a cup of tea if we could. And as would happen in a human engagement like this, in addition to taking on these affidavits, we began to talk about ourselves. And we would ask each other, well, what do you do? And, etc. And whenever it got to what I did, I was always a little awkward because I was a university teacher and I taught biblical studies and never quite knew what to do with that. And so I'd sort of try and avoid that as long as I could. But eventually they said, well, what do you do at the university? So I'd say, well, I teach biblical studies. And at that moment, the conversation would change. Then and many, many times after that. As soon as people realized that that's what I did, they would say, this is very exciting. This is important. And talk would turn to the Bible. So it was very clear the Bible was already present among these people. The majority would have been Christian and devout, church attending, going to many different kinds of churches during the week. And they wanted to talk about the Bible. And what they said to me was, the Bible is so important, but we cannot hear it speak. We cannot hear it speak. So I said to them, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, all the churches are doing is burying us. And so we hear the Bible being read at funerals. But nobody helps us. The Bible isn't speaking to us. God is silent. And then they look at me with this sort of expectation in their eyes and say, but you must come. Next time you come, you must bring your Bible, and we must study the Bible together, and because we need to hear God speak. And that moment, and I can remember it vividly, in 1988 or 1989, became for me a turning point where the intellectual struggle I was having with where were the marginalized in the reading of the Bible in the liberation struggle. And here were a group of marginalized people saying, we want to read the Bible. And it was a turning point for me. And from that moment on, colleagues and I and students and people from this refugee camp began to form small groups. It was a messy process. It was a process during which we were afraid most of the time. Every time we left the refugee camp, the car would be searched. We never knew when the military might plant things in the car. They kept, alleging that we were taking weapons into these camps, etc. So it was a difficult time. Our families were being harassed. So I don't want to romanticize it. It was not a good time. It was a very, very difficult time, and we never slept well on any night because we never knew when the knock might come on the door. And so it was a difficult time, but a transformative time. And so we began to construct these little Bible study groups. And there were a range of different theoretical and theological impulses feeding into this. But at the root of it was how do we work with the presence of the Bible? The Bible is already present in communities of the marginalized. So how do we work with that Bible but enable it to speak? That was the sort of challenge. And we drew on a range of resources. I was sent to Brazil by the South African Council of Churches in 1990, where I met with the SEBI movement and tried to learn from them, and came back and brought back resources. And I traveled all over Southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, trying to learn from whatever practices were going on, how we might work with the Bible in ways that were liberating, where the Bible was not silent in the midst of struggle, but spoke, where God was speaking through Scripture. And it was a remarkable time, and it was during that time that what we now call contextual Bible study, with capital letters, in South Africa, was kind of formed. It took its shape in those really very early years, in this kind of messy way of small groups, harassed and frightened, but committed to transformation in the anti-apartheid struggle. So contextual Bible study emerges out of that reality. And I wanted to start by telling you that story because I think, as Paulo, I think, also indicated when he spoke, and he used the story of the road to Emmaus, contextual Bible study is not about technique. It's not about method. It's about life. And so that's really important. We become very anxious about our work being understood as technique. Worst of all, being seen as a research technique, as it has in some parts of the world, and that worries us because it really is a way of life. It's a set of values, and that's why I've given you these values on the screen. I hope you can all see them. And these we would agree on as SEBI in Brazil and Ujuma here in South Africa. We met at the beginning of last year for a great workshop. And Crystal was there in Bogota, Colombia, and one evening SEBI and Ujuma met together and said, look, it's important that at this workshop people don't go away thinking that they've just got a whole set of different techniques, methods, that they can take away. They've got to know that they're part of a movement of some kind that is shaped by certain values. And so we started to share what our values were. And of course, this is an ongoing discussion. We've been having this discussion for over 30 years that I can remember, and it probably goes back before then. We always had ways of remembering our values or commitments. And in Ujamaa, we spoke of the 4 or 5 or 6 C's. And in Sebi, they spoke of the 5 fingers. And so you'd hold up your hand and you would count off. And we had this really great discussion in Bogota as we decided, were there 5 or were there 6? And we settled on the 6, actually. I came back from Bogota with these 6, and I shared it with colleagues at a workshop almost immediately that I got back from Bogota. We had a workshop with colleagues who work with Ujamaa from all over Southern Africa, and we went through it. And so we've elaborated on each of these, and if you're interested, we've got some resources on that. But we begin with the notion of community, that community is the fabric of contextual Bible study. It shapes everything. Everything is about building community, working within community. So that's a sort of fundamental reality. The second criticality is a recognition that the resources of scholarship, biblical and theological scholarship, really are important, that they add something. They're not the most important thing, and a great deal of what biblical and theological scholarship does is actually not of much use in political struggles. But there may be critical resources from biblical and theological studies that can be useful in communities. And both Sebi and Ujamaa are committed to discerning what kinds of critical resources are. And by critical, we simply mean structured and systematic sets of questions. That would be our definition of critical. Structured and systematic sets of questions with respect to the Bible and theology. The third is collaboration. In Ujamaa, we think of this as the collaboration between marginalized communities, organic intellectuals from those communities, and socially engaged biblical and theological scholars, some of whom may come from those communities, but others who would perhaps come from more privileged communities, like myself, for example, but who have been converted, born again from below by marginalized communities. And so collaboration is this thick, textured reality of constant engagement with each other, learning from each other, shaping each other. The fourth is about change. Contextual Bible study is not about knowing your Bible better. It's about changing society, changing our context. And change here is systemic change. We are interested in the change of individuals, and I think we've become more aware of that as the years have gone by, but the focus is not so much on that, but it's on systemic change, changing the structures that shape our lives. And so in the days when we began, it was the struggle against the systems of apartheid. And so we've had to move, as time has moved on here in South Africa, for example, we've had to discern and understand and analyze the different kinds of systems of injustice, systems of death that shape our world. And of course, this is a challenge in a globalized world because the systems are not just local systems anymore. They are systems that cut across our localities. But change is important. Systemic change is really important. Structural change. Context, what we understand here about context is the layeredness of life. That context is not one thing. It's not just politics. It's also economics. It's also religion. It's culture. It's all the dimensions of life in an intersecting kind of way. And so a rich and thick understanding of context is really important for the work. And then the last one, number 6. This led to the most discussion on that evening in Bogota. Before we shared it the next day, before we shared these values with the group the next day. Because in Ujamaa, I think we are clear on this, the 6th C of contestation. It was not that clear with CB, and they indicated that they themselves were debating this issue, whether or not we can speak of the Bible itself as a site of struggle. And what we mean by this is not that the Bible is interpreted differently. We all accept that. What we're saying here is that the Bible is intrinsically a conflicted text, a text of different voices contending with each other. To put it even more strongly, that the Bible can in itself, inherently bring death, and it can bring life, and that therefore you have to contend for life over against the biblical testimony that will bring death. So increasingly in Ujamaa, we work with this notion of a contested sacred text. And this goes back for us to the work of black theology in the 1980s, the work of Tumlin Masala and Takatsu Mofokeng. So this is what we grew up with, and it's always been a part of our work. But it's been much harder for people from other contexts to grapple with this. There is a tendency, and there has been, for example, in Latin American liberation theology, to see the Bible as on the side of the liberation struggle, and that's a lovely idea. But we think the reality of the Bible is different, and I think feminist work, for example, has offered us ways to understand that contestation within the biblical text itself. So I mention these values as a way of saying that contextual Bible study is about values. It's about an orientation to life. It's about a way of life. It's not firstly about method. But method is important, and so I want to just say something briefly about method. I'm going to move now to my next slide. I hope you can see that. And if Brandon's right, I can even draw here for a bit. No. Yes. Okay. So in terms of method, we think of contextual Bible study as having three kind of intersecting or concentric moments of method. The first one is here. How's that? I hope Brandon's impressed by that. is the movement from see to judge to act. So that's the first kind of movement that shapes our lives. Life is about seeing, analyzing reality, and we need to analyze reality because reality must be judged theologically by the voice of God. That's what judge means. It's what does God say about this reality? Is this reality according to God's kingdom? Not kingdom. We don't like the word kingdom, but we like the word kin, K-I-N, dom, kingdom. So, and we judge the reality of our contemporary contexts through the theological and biblical tradition, discerning the voice of God. What is God saying about this reality? Is this reality conforming to God's kingdom? And if not, then of course we need to act to change that reality. And so see, judge, act is simply a cycle of praxis. And once you take an action, you then need to see again, analyze what change has your action brought. Has it brought life rather than death? And so the process of see, judge, act continues. It's really a nice way of thinking about doing the kind of work we're doing. We structure all our workshops as a see, judge, act process. We structure our year as Ujamaa as a see, judge, act process. It's become a way of life for us, and I think the same in Sibi. The process comes from the worker priest movement within the Catholic Church in Belgium, I think in the 1930s or 40s, and it's been taken up by various forces, and for us it's a very good overall way of framing what we do. See, judge, act. So that's the first movement. Within that movement and sort of overlapping with it is another movement where we move from the community to criticality and then back to the community. So that would be our second movement. Contextual Bible study begins in the community, begins with the realities and resources of the community. We call this community consciousness. And so every particular Bible study begins with community consciousness. But even before we begin a contextual Bible study, we are located within a community. It's important to say that a contextual Bible study is often only an element of a larger process of working in a community. And the community itself will be doing a whole range of things. And they will invite us then, as one of the things that they want to do, is to do contextual Bible study. And even our own workshops are structured in that way. We would like, where possible, in our own workshops to start off with contextual Bible study as a way then of enabling a conversation to take place around a particular issue identified in a community. And then the rest of the day focuses around that and brings in other resources other than contextual Bible study resources. So we begin with the community. And then we end with the community. The community is where contextual Bible study belongs. It's not about Ujuma. We are servants of the community. And so it's important that whatever happens at the end of the day in terms of the Seed Judge Act, when actions are decided, it's the community that decides what actions to do, not Ujuma. We will facilitate coming to forms of action. We will participate in forms of action. We will evaluate forms of action if we invited to do so. But in the end, what the community decides to do with the contextual Bible study is the community's business, which is why, for us, it's important, where possible, to work in organized communities. And where groups are not organized, we will try and facilitate groups to be organized so that we are engaging with a robust community which has its own voice and which can talk back to people like us who have considerable power as Ujuma. We've got resources, we've got education, etc. And so it's important that we work with community groups that can stand over against us, can have their own identity and their own agenda over against us. And they are the ones then who facilitate our presence among them. So we begin with the community, we end with the community, and then this middle bit here, this middle moment is what we call critical consciousness. And here we are using critical, as I said earlier, in the sense of a structured and systematic engagement with biblical and theological resources, where we try to slow down the process of Bible reading. John Richards and his team in Glasgow, in Scotland, who've been doing contextual Bible study now for a long time, since '95 when we did some workshops among them, and they now have their own identity and their own ways of working. But John Richards and his group speak about slowing down the process of reading in contexts where the Bible is already present, as in African contexts. Most engagement with the Bible is what we would call quick engagement. People read the Bible and know the Bible, they love the Bible, but when they read it, they say, we know what that says. And contextual Bible study is saying, well, let's slow that down. Let's read it more carefully and more slowly. And how do we do that? We use the critical resources of biblical scholarship. We offer those. We offer them in terms of questions. We don't give lectures on biblical studies or theology. It's a way of asking a question. So, an example, who are the characters in this text, and what are the relationships between those characters? Now, for those of you who've done some biblical studies training, it's clearly a literary question. But the effect of that question is to slow down the process. In order to answer that question, who are the characters and what do we know about them, people have to reread the text. And so what happens in a contextual Bible study is a return over and over and over again to reading the text. It's a constant rereading of the text. And we use a range of resources. Our sets of resources are indicated here, in this here. We like to think of contextual Bible study as a movement from thematic and semiotic engagements with the text to begin with, then a movement to literary, often narratological dimensions of the text, a movement to the socio-historical dimensions that produce the text, and then come back again to the thematic and semiotic resources that we will take away from the text, that will then lead into the community action. So here you can see how the three moments of contextual Bible study method connect. Now, we don't always use a behind-the-text approach, and this has been some debates, particularly with parts of CB a long time ago. CB's moved, I think, around this issue, and we moved very quickly because we realized that we needed to recognize that in our communities the Bible is always present, and we wanted to work with people's own engagements with the Bible and not bring in knowledge and resources that silence people. And so if you begin behind the text, you simply silence people, because how would they know what the temple in Jerusalem was doing in the first century? They don't know that. But they can read Mark 11 and 12 and 13 and discern from the themes in the text and from the structure of the text as a literary narrative. They can discern a great deal about what's going on in the temple in Mark 11, 12, and 13. And so we have a Bible study on that is extremely useful and powerful. So we've developed this, that we begin in front of the text. Why? Because that's the most accessible dimension of the text that people have access to. We then slow the process down by focusing on literary dimensions of the text, what one might think of as character, plot, narrative point of view, setting, all these literary dimensions, without ever mentioning any of those terms, other than perhaps character, but asking questions about, where does Jesus move in the temple, which is a reference to setting. What about the time features in the story of the rape of Tamar? How does time move in the narrative, etc.? And that slows down the process, enables people to engage with the dimensions of the text that they wouldn't normally notice in a quick reading. And that often generates then, in the discussion and report back from small groups, behind the text questions, where people will say, but who are the Pharisees? And who are the Herodians? And why do the Sadducees ask the question that they do in Mark 11? And that's an opportunity then to begin to engage with the world that may well have produced the biblical text. And so we open the door through the first two sets of questions, thematic, semiotic, and literary, for socio-historical questions and input and information and discussion. But then we move always towards, again, thematic, semiotic. What is it that you're taking away from this text? And obviously a lot of detail has emerged a lot of detail has emerged within a 3-hour process, within a contextual Bible study. But what is it that the group will take away from that? And it's often an image, a theme, some ideas new ideas that have emerged that become the basis for community-based action. And so we try to end, again, in front of the text, with the community being able to take away from the text things that are useful to them. Now, having said all that, none of this works without facilitation. So contextual Bible study includes, as I indicated, those values. It includes these kinds of methods. And then thirdly, what enables all this to work is facilitation. And those are the skills of enabling group participation. And we realize now, as Ujuma, that these skills are not, we cannot take them, for example, we cannot take them for granted anymore. They were part of the fabric of our formation in the 80s and 90s as part of the liberation struggle. We were disciplined to be facilitated, particularly white people like myself, who were used to being in charge. We were disciplined not to be in charge, to play different kinds of roles. And so the skills of facilitation were really important, and we were all formed by those. And we realize now that they're not, too much TV, too much social media, all these sorts of things, people have lost the skills of group work, of group process, of enabling community and drawing on the resources of all those present. So facilitation is key. And what we think emerges out of this, why we think this is important, as I said, is not because we get to know our Bibles better. It's because the Bibles now speak. God speaks in ways that are useful. And we place a great deal of emphasis on the word useful. If contextual Bible study is not useful, then there's no point. So usefulness. Is the Bible useful in communities of faith as they struggle in their own context of struggle for liberation and for life? And so what we understand happens in a contextual Bible study is that some form of what we would call people's theology begins to emerge. In other words, what happens in a small group is that a vocabulary is built from the biblical resources, from the theological resources, from the community's resources, and out of that vocabulary, a theology is constructed. The beginnings of a theology, what we would call, what the Kairos document called a people's theology. And this people's theology is in the body of people already. It's through contextual Bible study that what's in the body becomes articulated, becomes owned by the group. People in the group say, oh yes, that's it, and people get excited. And they now have a theological language from Scripture which they can now use, deploy in their particular actions that they take. And it's part of our work as Ujuma is also to reflect on this people's theology and to offer additional resources around that people's theology so that it might become a more public form of what we would call prophetic theology. And prophetic theology is then a more public structured form of theology that begins to engage with dominant theologies in our context. So, for example, around HIV, the dominant theologies are death-dealing theologies. They are theologies that tell people who are HIV positive that God is punishing them or disciplining them. It's a very pervasive theology. And so a people theology emerges in our work around HIV, and those who are HIV positive no longer give any recognition to theologies of retribution and begin to articulate other kinds of theologies. And we would then begin to mobilize around those people's theologies to produce a prophetic theology, which in the public realm begins to speak against theologies of retribution and offers the church, ministers and pastors and priests, resources to engage differently with HIV. And in each of the areas in which we work, this is the kind of work we like to do. So a clear movement from people's theology to prophetic theology and then to a transformative public theology. And I want to conclude then by coming back to see and to judge and to act. Because as one does this work around HIV, for example, which we've been doing now for probably close to 20 years, you find that HIV, the context of HIV, raises other contextual sites of struggle, other areas of struggle. And so at the moment, for example, we're dealing with issues of sexuality in all its guises, but particularly LGBTIQ forms of sexuality, marginalized sexualities. And so See, Judge, Act enables you to recognize where the spaces are emerging within a community, where a marginalized sector within a marginalized community is beginning to say, yes, it's been great that we've been working around HIV, but we are marginalized even within this group because we are lesbian or because we are gay. Won't you do some work with us around that? And so you begin a new process of see, judge, and act. And this is why it's so important for socially engaged biblical scholars and theologians to be embedded, to be located within and among communities of the marginalized. Not because we want to do Bible study, but because it's where God wants us to be And out of our presence in those communities, we are summoned, if you like, by the communities and by our training as biblical scholars and theologians to make a contribution from our critical training, but only on terms that the community allows and invites and nurtures. So it's not a missionary project. It's a project of being a part of community. Thank you, Crystal.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerald, for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us. As we move into the question and answer period, if you haven't done so already, I would invite you to raise your questions in the chat box, and which is probably in the bottom left corner of your screen. So if you haven't done so already, please be raising your questions, and Matthew and I will be moderating those questions and communicating them to Gerald. So the first question came from Stu, who asked a question with reference to that first introductory story that you told. He asked, was the belief that God only speaks through the reading or the study of the Bible? He was wondering why the people that you were working with felt that God was silent, yet viewed the Bible as important and the only source to hear God. So I think he's asking a particularly contextual question about that experience and what was the role of the Bible specifically.
Okay, nice. Thank you, Stu. In our context, the Bible does have a significant presence. I've just finished a book now, which looks at the reception of the Bible in Southern Africa from 1652 up until today. And so it's a book that tries to analyze how indigenous Africans engage with a book that is brought by Dutch imperial forces to South Africa. But there is no doubt that the Bible is an African book, and that's the story of my new book, how the Bible has become an African book. And so that is the reality in our context. And it doesn't mean that God doesn't speak in other ways. I mean, there's a real openness to other ways in which God might speak in our context, and strong sense of a spiritual world through which God speaks in a whole range of ways. But the Bible has a particular significance. And it's almost as if without the Bible, the other forms of God speaking are not as palpable. The Bible somehow needs to be present in order to not validate, that's too strong, but to be part of that discourse. And so claims that God is speaking would be heard, would be entertained, but the Bible becomes then a way of sort of confirming and affirming God speaking. So this is why it's so important to work with the Bible. We've seen here in South Africa since liberation, where a lot of prophetic theologians and biblical studies and biblical scholars have gone on to do other things, good things, and sort of left the Bible behind while they are working on the Constitution or on voter education or on legal issues or really good things. And what has happened since liberation is the Bible has been almost completely taken over by what the Kairos document called church theology, what I would call evangelical forms of theology that are focused on individual spirituality, privatized spirituality, not engaging with the systems of life, of reality. And so it is important that we engage the Bible. That's why we speak of the Bible as a site of struggle, because if you do not harness the Bible, if you do not work with the Bible to bring about transformation and change, to bring about life, it will cause death in a context like ours. Thanks, Stu.
Great. Thank you. So the next question comes from Jasmine, and it's a question specifically about methodology. She asks, what kinds of questions are asked in the first thematic semiotic approach, or what does this approach entail?
Nice. Jasmine, thank you. We do this sort of differently in a range of different ways. So we almost always, if you look at any of our Bible studies, and if you go to our Ujamaa website, you can find our manual on the website under resources. You'll find a whole load of other contextual Bible studies. And if you look through them, you'll find that the first question in almost any contextual Bible study is, what do you think the text is about? But that question is often not asked in a vacuum. It's important to say that contextual Bible study is always saturated within an infrastructure of liturgy, of prayer, of worship, of singing religious songs, often very political songs, but religious songs. As I indicated, contextual Bible study is a moment in a day or a weekend of other things going on. And often there are all sorts of faith events taking place. And that's really important, so that the semiotic thematic is there from the beginning. I mean, in most cases, the community will, in almost every case, the community will decide what the theme is. They will say, no one's talking about homosexuality, but we hear that Ujamaa will do work on homosexuality. Can you come and do a workshop with us on homosexuality? So the theme comes already from the community. And we say, okay, we'll come. And then we'll arrive, and the community's doing all sorts of things. They may have got a nurse in to talk about what happens in the clinics. When we go to the clinics and we ask for condoms because we are two gay men partners, the nurse will say, no, you can't have it because it's not right for two men to have sex. But she will give condoms to a male and a female who ask for them. And so that will be fed back to us, and the nurses will be asked, why are you doing this? And then we will do a contextual Bible study, for example, around homosexuality. And we have, and it's been an amazing process. We work very closely with the Gay Lesbian Network here in Pietermaritzburg. And so we're working almost always with organized communities that we bring in through our networks in Ujamaa with church leadership, pastors and ministers and priests of all kinds. And so I wanted to emphasize, Jasmine, that there's already a rich semiotic space that exists before we do a contextual Bible study. And then we might use various resources. We often look for African woodcuts, liner cuts, which we have a lot of resources like that in Africa of missionary trained artists who tell the story of the Bible in images on liner cuts or woodcuts, and we might use one of those, or we might use a drama as a way into the text, but we would almost always then as a signal almost of moving into a close reading of the text, saying, okay, here is this text that we will be considering today on Genesis 18 and 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. And what do you think this text is about? Now, this is where the facilitation thing is really important, because when you ask a question like that, the first response is silence. As people say, well, Ujamaa said they're going to tell us what this text is about, because that's what their pastors do. That's what they see on TV. Our leaders all do this. They speak. So we don't. We don't speak. And one of the key tasks of facilitation is not to speak. So you say, what is this text about? And you don't say anything. And eventually someone's going to want to break the silence. And I'll say, well, I think this text is about God's judgment. And then what we do is we affirm that. We normally have a facilitator, and we have someone who then we call a scribe. And the scribe will, on newsprint, big sheets of paper, I think you know what those are, newsprint, they will write up God's judgment. So just write it up, God's judgment. And the facilitator, and of course everyone's watching this, and And the facilitator is not making any other comment, simply saying, oh, God's judgment, thank you very much. Anybody else? And after you've had 2 or 3 people offering things, you can't stop people. And the newsprint just gets full. And then as it gets full, we tear it off and we stick it up on the wall. And so by the end of a workshop, you are surrounded by the voices of the community. And that first question, what is the text about? Embedded as it is within liturgy and community-based work of various kind, that question gives you a rich sense of how the community already understands this text. And they're already beginning to relate this text to the theme that they've invited you for. But you also pick up a range of other things that this text may speak to. And again, if you are going through this process of See, Judge, Act as a facilitator, you begin to say, this text could also speak to issues of leadership or could speak to issues of gender. So you begin to note these things already for perhaps another workshop, but you stay focused on the theme that you've been invited to engage with. So a question like that, what is the text about? Or have you heard this text before? In what context is this text used? How do people normally preach about this text in your church? A question like that enables people to engage with the text thematically. And you're offered a rich reception history, if you like, of this text in the community, if the text has a reception history in the community. Because we also work with texts that the community is almost unaware of. The story of the rape of Tamar, 2 Samuel 13, is a text that just doesn't get read on Sundays in church, even in churches with lectionaries. And often people will say, oh, we've never heard this text before. What a strange text. Are you sure it's in the Bible? But we think it's about this, or we think it's about that. And so that first question is just a way of affirming everybody's presence, and everybody begins to own the text. And so we always ask that question, almost always, in the large group, of 30 or 40 or 100 or 200 or 300 or 400, depending on the group. And we get everybody to jump in. And then we break people into small groups to do the slower work of critical reading of the Bible. I hope that makes sense, Jasmine.
Great, thank you. So before moving back to follow-up questions from Stu and Jasmine, I wanted to raise a question from another individual, John, who asks, how does the proclamation of Christian truth, or what he defines as basic orthodoxy, intersect with a people's theology? What is just a second. What is the relationship of the facilitator of the group to this intersection, if there is any intersection?
John, thank you. Look, it's very clear that we as Ujamaa work within a theological tradition of liberation theology. And we would argue that framing of that theological framing of the work we do, which is not orthodox, is a biblical theology. Not the only theology, but a strong biblical theology. It's the theology that emerges in Exodus with the God who hears the cry of slaves and responds. It's the theology of the prophets who take on the monarchy and take on the returning elites from exile in Persia. And it's the theology of the Jesus movement and Jesus himself, who is born among a marginalized people and constructs a community of marginalized people. And so for us, we work within that biblical theology. We would recognize that there are other theologies that are more dominant, and we would recognize, I think, that those are more orthodox theologies, I think. As I indicated, for us, people's theology is vital. In the end, we would hope that people's theology would make its contribution to the more public orthodox theologies of our day, whatever they might be. And so we yearn for a society in which marginalized communities, when they go to church, would recognize themselves and their own people's theologies in the public theology of their own church. The reality is there's not a lot of that recognition, which is why Ujamaa gets invited, of course, into communities of faith, because the Bible is strangely silent in certain aspects of their lives. Of course, the Bible speaks volubly, speaks clearly around a whole lot of other issues, because the people we work with are all church people in some way, although some, of course, have been chased out of their churches because of HIV or sexuality or economics, because they're unemployed. And God is judging them because they don't have a job. It's a sign that they've done something wrong. And, so we live in a world where religion is very, very important in the lives of people, but it does a great deal of harm as well as good. And so we position ourselves in a particular theological tradition of what we would consider liberation theology as it's evolved in our context, or what we refer to as prophetic theology. But we recognize that prophetic theology must engage with church theology, the dominant theologies of the churches, and must engage with the Christian tradition, if you like, particularly for us, the African Christian tradition, in all its complexity. But we are open. We work with churches, for example, that don't hold very strong views on the Trinity. One of the big churches in our area, the Church of Isaiah Shembe. Isaiah Shembe was a prophet, a healer, baptizer, who founded a church, I suppose you could call it. He doesn't call it a church, he calls it a congregation, a community in the early 1900s. And Shembe is not trained by missionaries. But the Bible is absolutely important. In fact, the name for my new book is the Stolen Bible. And I get that term, the Stolen Bible, from a sermon that Isaiah Shembe preached in 1933, where he tells the story of those who came, the colonizers who came and stole our cattle. We stole their Bible. And it's their Bible that enables us never, ever again to be colonized. A remarkable sermon from someone who has no missionary training, maybe a few Wesleyan hymns. He loves hymns, and then God gives him hymns and visions. He's a healer. There's many miracle stories surrounded by Shembe. And then I have colleagues who say, well, he's not really Christian because he doesn't have a strong view of the Trinity. I must be honest. We will work where we're invited to work. We don't judge the orthodoxy of the groups we work with. We offer the resources we have if we are invited. We try to serve the community that we are working among. Sorry, I think my screen may have gone. Okay. So John, we recognize that the theological orientation is not mainstream, not orthodox in any Western sense anyway. It resonates strongly, though, with forms of African theology. There's no doubt. And so we are welcomed. I mean, I can't think of a group that doesn't welcome us among them. And we've been doing this for long enough now that some of those who were marginalized 30 years ago are now people of considerable power. They're bishops, they're political leaders. And they invite us, even though they find it hard to hear our commitment to the marginalized, but they feel it's important that we make some sort of contribution at a church synod, for example. We don't raise questions of orthodoxy, and I wouldn't consider what we do orthodox, but I don't think we dismiss the traditions that we work among. As I indicated, we offer resources into a community of faith. And that community already has resources. It has biblical resources. It has theological resources. We're not trying to undermine those. We're trying to add resources, add capacity for engaging with something that the community is struggling to engage with.
Thank you, Gerald. So there's two follow-up questions from Stu and from Jasmine, both pretty methodological. The first one from Stu is about the behind the text discussion. He writes, I can see the wisdom of not going deep into the socio-historical background of the text too early in the study process. I have seen a tendency to try and formalize methods, rituals, and rules, especially from the Old Testament, rather than engage with the themes or principles of the text. Is this fair to say? Is the question from Stu. And then Jasmine had a question, who chooses the text that gets analyzed? Or who chooses the text for study?
Great. Thank you to Stu and to Jasmine. Stu, in terms of how we would understand our work, whether it's the semiotic or the literary or the socio-historical, we would understand that partly what we are returning to the communities is the detail of the text. Okay, as I said, we are working in communities for whom the Bible is pretty well known, and they would be familiar with it in broad terms. Part of what contextual Bible study does, we think, is it introduces detail that is not being recognized before, or it offers detail in a different perspective from that which it's normally seen. A good example would be in our work on Mark, the temple narrative in Mark. We begin with the widow giving in the temple. Jesus sits down and watches her giving. And we begin there because it's a well-known text. Everybody knows this text. It's a text used by all our churches to encourage people to give. So she's an example of giving, and in fact of faithful sacrificial giving. But we then read the text on either side of her giving. And we begin to allow small groups to construct the larger literary unit. We work with the unit from 11:27 to 13:2, which is all in the same setting. It's all in the temple. Although Jesus does come into the temple twice before that in Mark, from 11:27 to 13:2, he does not leave the temple. It's all within one setting. And we think Mark uses setting very often as a way of demarcating kind of shifts or chapters, if you like. And so we're offering that critical resource. We're saying, does it make sense to read the story of the faithful widow within the larger literary context of Mark 11:27 to 13:2? And by the end of a long 3-4 hour Bible study, people are amazed because, yes, she is a faithful giver, but she's being identified by Jesus, not only because she's a faithful giver, but because she is a victim of the temple system in first century Palestine. And then people say, I want to know about the system, and that leads us then into how temples function in the ancient world, how would a widow like this have had her house devoured, which is the pericope, the paragraph immediately before Jesus watching her. He criticizes the scribes for devouring widows' houses. What does that mean? Well, the text doesn't really explain it. The text makes it clear she's poor because her house has been devoured. So when we meet a poor widow, it's not accidental she's poor. She's poor because the scribes have devoured her house. But how do scribes devour the house? Well, Mark offers us a range of clues. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, we might begin to dip into those. We might look at how temples function in the ancient world. We might look at how the Judaic leadership worked within economic systems, etc. So it's that sort of detail that gets offered. But as I keep saying, there's a lot of stuff going on in a contextual Bible study. There's lots of detail. Quite which of this detail people will take away from the Bible study is not always clear. And what's amazing for us, people like myself who biblical scholars, is I don't come away from one of these workshops, and I've been doing this for a long time, nearly 30 years. I never come away from a Bible study without having learned something. I mean that genuinely. Stuff I've never read in the commentary, stuff I've never thought up by myself, and I come away saying, yo, that's an amazing insight. And it's some detail that has become significant to a particular small group. Maybe not the whole group, but a particular small group within a larger group. And for them, it catalyzes their theological capacities, their resources for action in changing their context. So we are not always just looking for the principles of Scripture. I think Stu, we are wanting to say is we might not know what the principles of Scripture are. This is why we say in Ujamaa you need to be born again again. The first time you're born again from above, but the second time you've got to be born again from below. In other words, as a scholar, you've got to honestly come into a workshop saying, look, I've done a lot of work on this text, I have a sense of what this text might be about, but I will be open to being surprised, to learning something, and to coming away saying, so this is what the text is about. And it's that is the heartbeat of our work. It's the heartbeat of me as a scholar. It's the heartbeat of my teaching, is to recognize that I don't have, a preemptive right to biblical knowledge. So we're not simply saying that semiotic and literary themes are key. We're saying it could be any kind of detail that has come up. It could be semiotic detail, a particular image from Job chapter 3 in working with people living with HIV, and that's what happened. A particular image in Job chapter 3 is Job laments his life. Why was he born? And HIV-positive people ask this question. And so you read through chapter 3. We're tired of chapter 1:21, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. We hear that at funerals too often. But that we encounter the same Job speaking differently in chapter 3. Contextual Bible studies is about chapter 3. And so we look at its poetry, and the images there, different members will pick up different images. And those become key. In the temple narrative, it's about the structure of the narrative. The very way in which Mark structured the narrative becomes significant for people. Or some information they didn't know about the temple state system in first century Palestine. So it could be anything. And we're offering resources that may be of use to the community. And so that links to Jasmine's question about choosing of the text. It really does depend on the processes that we're involved in, Jasmine. So, for example, we've been doing some work for many years now with a project called the Church Land Program. They're an activist program working with urban and rural communities of the marginalized around land issues. And Ujamaa has been invited to work with them on producing a set of Bible studies around land issues. And we've done that. We've produced a set of Bible studies. But now that was a really well-facilitated process which included the Church Land Program, Ujamaa, and a range of community-based organizations, urban and rural. And we workshopped for weeks and months which texts we should work on. So it was a group process. We decided, we as a group decided on what texts would be useful. Now, as Ujamaa, we will offer suggestions. We'll say, well, what about this? And it's because the biblical scholars among us within the work of the Ujamaa network often read the Bible more carefully or read parts. They don't always get read in the life of the church. We do have texts that resonate. And I mean, a lot of my own work is about wondering. As I sit in a group, wondering, as a group raises an issue they want us to deal with, I think, well, are there texts that might speak to this? But I don't always know. And for example, around HIV, we were taught by communities of HIV-positive people what text to read. We made some ideas initially around healing texts, and we were clearly wrong. Leprosy texts, not interested. Communities are not interested in those things. So we had to go. We're not afraid to fail in trying to serve communities. And so we will say, is this useful? And sometimes it isn't. But they'll say, no, what we are looking for is a text like this text. And they will give you an option. So a text like Mark 3, where Jesus comes into the synagogue and is a man with a withered hand. And Jesus identifies him and recognizes that the leadership of that religious institution is not enabling his healing. Jesus recognizes that and stands against them and stands with the man with the withered hand, bringing him to the middle or center, perhaps the very place where Torah is located. And he's angry with the religious establishment for not enabling a healing of this man with the withered hand. And so they were saying to us, people living with HIV, that's the text we want, because the church stands against us. because society stands against us, but Jesus doesn't. Are there other texts like this? And of course, there are many like that in the Gospels. And so that's what led us to many, many contextual Bible studies using Gospel texts. But then there was a moment where we recognized the need for lament. Because again, it came up after a funeral. We were talking about being angry at listening to Job 1:21. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's a funeral text. And we were talking among ourselves with people who are HIV positive, who may well have been dying, because in those days we didn't have antiretrovirals. And we were saying how angry we were. We were burying someone who was 17 years old or 25 years old, and people were saying, the Lord gives. We were saying, this is nonsense. This is not God's work. This is not God's work at all. And in the midst of this, I probably foolishly said, but you know, that's not how Job keeps speaking. And people said, what do you mean? That's what Job says. I said, yes, I know, but a little bit later, he speaks differently. Now, what do you mean? I said, well, in Job chapter 3, they said, come do a Bible study on that. And that began a long process of years of working on the book of Job, and we've just finished a Bible study on Job chapter 42. We've gone all the way to the end, journeying with groups of organized people who are HIV positive. Now, you know, it came out of this sort of organic, rather messy process of being angry with Job 1:21. So the text comes up in all sorts of different kinds of ways. We just alert to those moments when a text might be useful, and part of what I do as a biblical scholar, when I read biblical scholarship, that's what I'm reading biblical scholarship for. Now, this is really important to those of you biblical scholars. I'm not thinking primarily of talking to other biblical scholars. I like doing that, but I'm interested in what biblical scholarship might have to offer to the communities in which I work. So I'm always looking for stuff. So when I read a journal article, that's my primary sort of lens. Is there something here in this article that I would never have found because it's not my area of scholarship, but somebody else has picked up something that could be really important for the communities in which I work? Now, the scholar who did that may have no idea that I'm doing that with their work. But that's okay. I don't care. If they've uncovered a detail, resources in the text that may be useful, I will take that and offer it to a community. And in that case, I might offer a text and say, this is a text that we never read like this, but what about thinking about it in this way? What do you think about that?
Hey, Gerald, I have just a couple of questions for you, if I may. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. This has been just so enjoyable. And those who have had to sign out have all been saying so as well. Enriching is one of the words that strongly comes to mind. Two questions. The first one isn't asked, I'll preface it, isn't asked out of skepticism, but in trying to find a way to better articulate answers to this question myself. When teaching my upper-level Bible and social justice course, I've had it more than once. Students bring up the Jefferson Bible. Are you familiar with the Jefferson Bible?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, it's a very American.
No. What is it?
One of our founders, Thomas Jefferson, basically went through the Bible and took out all the stuff he didn't like, and then kept the rest, and that was his Bible.
Yeah.
Quite a bold move. He was quite an ego. But at any rate, I've had it asked to me before, when dealing with text on justice, and what made me think of this was I really liked how you talked about theology of death and prophetic theology, and that the voices of life need to trump those of death. What do you suggest we do with those texts that promote death? Do you think that they should be ripped out and ignored, and then what are the implications of that? Or that those texts need to be addressed, but perhaps addressed in the light of the problems they cause as these problematic texts? And then my second question, I'll just throw that in right now, was on, it's very clear in your work with the marginalized how they've benefited from this, and you've made it so clear as well as how you've benefited from working with them and getting their perspectives on Bible and what's of use to them. And I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, I've been doing a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff here, but have you ever had an instance in which not one of the marginalized communities when you've been working with, but one of those who marginalized have been touched by contextual Bible study or caused to view the oppression that they enact in a different way. So I'll leave those two with you, and I'll turn off my video here.
Matthew, thank you. It's always good to have these conversations with you, and thank you for the many years of these conversations. Matthew, this is why, for us in Ujamaa, this number 6 is so important. I think we've begun to realize that we often give the impression in our work, and a colleague from the United States, Gerald Anderson, who teaches at Gerald Evangelical and does a lot of work particularly within the African American community around issues of HIV and sexuality. Cheryl's been a fellow traveler with us for many years in Ujamaa, and we've done lots of work together. And Cheryl helped us to see this. She was kind of saying to us, isn't your work seen as making an argument that the Bible is in favor of liberation? And I think that's the impression we give. In other words, if you ask the communities in which we work, they'd say, yes, the Bible is about life, it's about liberation, it's not about death. But what Cheryl helped us to see, I think, was that 2 weeks after we were there, or a month after we were there, the dominant ways in which the Bible is read in their community may start to assert themselves again. And so for example, in the context of HIV, we've done this really amazing work around lament and Job's arguments against theologies of retribution, but the theology of retribution is a powerful one in the life of the church, and so after a month or so, the very people who were part of our workshop were beginning to say, but you see now the pastor's not, the pastor's got this, he's just reminding us again that we're sinners. So we realized we need to be more overt about that we are contesting with a text that is itself in contestation. And so we've become much more overt at doing this in our work. And we've even worked with particular groups of local church ministers very overtly in a series of workshops, kind of almost asking them, can you work with this? Can you work with this idea that the Bible doesn't have a single voice, that it has voices standing over against each other, arguing with each other? And we've gone back to some of the early work of Walter Brueggemann, for example, which is very useful work. And I'm sorry Walter's moved away from some of that, but work he was doing in the 80s and early 90s in dialogue with Norman Gottwald, interestingly enough, around trajectories of consolidation and trajectories of prophetic voices, structural legitimation and consolidation. Structural legitimation and the embrace of pain, yes, structural legitimation and the embrace of pain. And so we use those kinds of ideas. And I do a lot of this work with my students. So when I'm teaching about the Bible and contextual Bible study in my classes, both undergraduate and graduate classes, I'm trying to help my students to understand that the Bible is not a single text. It doesn't have a single voice. It has these multiple voices, and these voices are often in dialogue with this. There's a debate. And I often start with non-controversial ones, like go back to 2 Samuel, where you have this debate that is going on about whether David should build a temple or not. And clearly the idea of does God live in a temple or does God live in a tent is a debate. And I don't think that debate is ever kind of resolved. It's a debate throughout Scripture. And you could argue that Jesus participates in that debate in Mark 13:2 when he says, do you see this temple? It will be destroyed. God doesn't live in temples, he lives in tents. But the idea that God lives in a temple is a very strong one as well. So if you work with a non-contentious example like that, you can then shift into other terrain around gender, around HIV, around disability, and see that their biblical texts offer different theological perspectives on these. And so we've become, I think, much more overt about that's what we're doing. We are wrestling with the texts so that we can hear the voice that brings life, which means recognizing also the voices that don't bring life. Now, fortunately, in South Africa, we have a long history of that. Apartheid, racial segregation, was built on the Bible. And so the majority of our people, the people we move and work among, black South Africans, they know that. So it's not that strange that the Bible has got voices within it that would promote apartheid, segregation of different kinds. So we have a legacy to draw on. In other parts of the African continent, it's harder to do this because the Bible is seen to be the Word of God in a singular kind of way. So part of what we are trying to contribute, I think, Matthew, is how do you talk about, among the communities, how do you talk about the Bible as the Word of God, but a contending Word of God within itself? So that's something we've become more overt about. And I mentioned Gerald Anderson because I wanted to say that this network that you've established and the other networks that we're a part of are really important because some other contexts can see things that you can't perhaps see and helps, the dialogue among us is very fruitful. So that was your first question. So we wouldn't tear out the texts of terror. We would engage them. We would try to read them in ways that bring life, but we would also recognize that they may bring death. Now, in terms of non-marginalized communities, I mean, this is a debate within Ujamaa, and an increasing debate, and because we've been doing this for so long. As I indicated, we've been doing this for long enough that we've got people now who are no longer marginalized, who see themselves as disciples of us, but they are bishops. They're not people who marginalize, they're powerful people. And how do we work with the powerful? It's particularly strong in the context of economics, where in the same church you've got those who are employers and those who are employees. And when you're talking about just wages, just work, or decent work, how do you work with both those who are exploited and those who exploit them? And that is a challenge for us, and we've grasped that challenge. We think it is important to work with all sectors, but, and the but is important, our starting point is always communities of the marginalized. So we will work with more privileged sectors, but only from the perspective of the marginalized. And so, for example, in our work on gender violence, we worked almost entirely with women and children for many years. But gradually men started to say to us, this is important for us. We need to take responsibility for our bodies and what we do in terms of our culture and religion. Can you work with us as well? And that's what we're always hoping for. We're hoping that as we work with one sector, it will reverberate into another sector. And because the church is the church, it has a cross-sectorial reach. That's a very significant thing. Almost no other agency does that. And so the church is a key site of struggle for us because it brings the powerful and the powerless, the oppressor and the oppressed together. And we are looking for ways of working with all sectors. But our starting point, our orientation is from below.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, I don't see any other questions in the chat box right now. We just have a few minutes left. Did anyone have another question for Gerald? Give them a moment here to type in case somebody is. That's a really good idea. While I'm giving them some time, I really like how you mentioned starting with less controversial debates within the Bible and then moving on from there. That's a great way to ease people into it. I see that Stu has one. Our view of what is the Bible and what we do with it, Peter ends, is so significant in how we view and handle these terror texts. What is your thinking on that?
Stu, I think it is, yeah. Look, we try to keep away from the theological discussions around inspiration and Word of God, etc. In other words, we don't deal with those directly. We would come at them obliquely through our practice, because our experience is that these are concepts that ordinary people really don't think are that important. But if you press that button, it will become important. Pastors and ministers and priests who are, gatekeepers, for them it might be more important to raise questions of inspiration and Word of God and that kind of thing. So we don't. We really consider, we just want to do Bible study, and we allow the community we work in to shape what they understand by the Bible. We don't sort of engage with that in any direct way. We engage with it only indirectly through our practice, through the way in which we work with the Bible. We are reverent towards the Bible. For us, the context of Bible reading as a worshipful context is important. It's authentic to us. I mean, we're all people of faith, devout people of faith. We're not instrumentalists. We're not doing this simply because the Bible is available and useful. We are struggling to know how to read God's Word in context of struggle. So we embody that. People can see that. We are faithful people among them. We do reverence the text, but we are wanting to say we read it. And we read it more carefully than the church reads it. And we might find things that we don't like or we find uncomfortable, but they're there. And so how do we engage with them? And that kind of honesty about what's in the text, people really respond to that. They might find it a bit uncomfortable, but they get excited about it. And of course, for lots of people, it's a breath of fresh air. They just say, oh, thank God. And if someone is being honest with us about what this text is saying, or what we think it's saying, and it's not saying good things. And so it's for us not being overt around this sort of overarching theological debates around infallibility or Word of God. It's strategic. We really don't go down that route. We work as faithful readers of the Bible, arguing that the Bible must be used for liberation in life, and contending for that reading within a particular local community. So, we don't mess with overtly with the theology around what the Bible is. We allow the Bible study to present the Bible as it is, in all its complexity and all its diversity. And we are surprised. I mean, when we first used the story of Tamar, the text of terror, we were not sure we were doing a good thing. I mean, that was in 1996, and we just didn't know. Phyllis Tribble had done some work on it. I'd read her work in 1984. When did the text of terror come out? Can't remember. But I'd read her work on text of terror, and when a group of women said to us, "Can you do work on gender violence?" We said, "Yeah." And colleagues sort of looked at me and said, "Well, what do we do with this? It's a tricky subject." And I said, "Well, there's this really rough text. It's about rape. That's an amazing story. Maybe you should try it." And it's been our most powerful contextual Bible study by far. It's used all over the world, and with an amazing impact. So here is a text of terror, but it brings life. It doesn't bring death. It brings life. It enables women to speak. So you're never quite sure how a text will be used and how they will bring life. So even a text of terror can bring life.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerald. Oh, sorry. Did I miss something, Gerald?
No. I read Phyllis Tribble's work in 1985. So I thought it must have been written before then. 1984, that's right.
Great. So for folks that are that don't have the chat, I just mentioned to Gerald that I just looked it up that Dr. Tribble's book, Text of Terror, was published in 1984. So Gerald was remembering correctly. Just as a last word of thanks, Gerald, it's been wonderful to learn from you and to discuss with you and to have questions answered from the participants. We really appreciate your wisdom and your experience and are very grateful for the opportunity to engage with you in this way. So thank you very much for your time and for your wisdom.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Gerald, and thank you to all of our participants very much.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Yes, we're going to be having. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Gerald. Oh,
no, I think just thank you to all those who've been sending me chat comments. I really appreciate those. Thank you.
Great. And yeah, thank you so much. And just a little plug for the next webinar will be May 7th, Saturday, May 7th, with Bob Ekblad at 3 p.m. Eastern, and then you can figure out the other times from there. And also, I encourage people to visit the Center and Library for Bible and Social Justice website, which is clbsj.org. It's about to go through a major overhaul, so it'll be changing and new and improved soon. But on there, you can find the contextual Bible study link. And shortly, we will be having the recordings of these up on there, along with PowerPoints. And very shortly, we'll be emailing the link for this particular Bible study to all of you who participated. So thank you again, Gerald, and thank you to all of our participants.
Thank you.
And have a lovely rest of your Saturdays, whatever time you're going on with it from now. I guess it's almost dinner time for you, Gerald.
It is. I can hear the dishes in the kitchen.
Right. Oh, that's always a good sound. All right.
Thanks,
Take
Matthew.
care, everybody.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Brendan.